I called him a nigger for acting like a fucking nigger.
He's a jerk off. He can only get a gook. He can't even get a regular girlfriend. It's so sad.
You fucking immigrant motherfucker!
Can you play music? Can you play music?
Yeah, all right. What I chat about you? What I chat about you? What I chat about you? No.
I call people niggers if they act like niggers.
What you mean? You put your hands on me for no reason. On this house?
Go get a job.
I have a
Go
fucking
get a
job. I'm babysitting.
Immigrant spit!
You call a nigga.
Naughty boy. We go back to China. We go back to China. We take up. We have strength.
Shut up. Do your job over there. How you over here and you supposed to be over there? Fuck out of here. Exactly.
Yo, I don't want to sit down, sir. I want to sit down. From what? No. Serious. I'm serious. I need to get
Get the fuck out of here, you fucking cunt! No, I need...
Touching your nosy girlfriend, you have to get a gook. You're so competent.
I'm actually married and
Is it that little, is it? Is it really that small you can't get a nosy girl? You poor man.
Why is racism such a big deal? Why are people prejudiced? What do people get out of belittling a difference in culture? And why is whatever they get out of it something that makes them feel so good? Over the last century, a great deal of psychologists has made advancements in answering these sorts of questions. From the analysis of personality theories, social theories, group theories, and other psychological approaches, I've concluded that in the modern world, the drivers of racism in society are dictated by psychological conceptions more so than conscious decisions made by individuals. While both are still existent, the conscious expression of open racism has obviously deteriorated in society. I believe a relationship that can be extrapolated is that as education increases, explicit racism decreases. Implicit racism does not change, and I'll talk about why later on, but let's focus on explicit racism for now. An investigation was conducted on racist-driven violence in Greater Manchester, a good place to start looking at explicit racism, as violent attacks is directly conscious. 40 perpetrators were used as subjects in an attempt to understand the motives of these senseless acts. The first interesting part of this investigation to note is how hard it was to source the 40 subjects. With hundreds of perpetrators available to them, individuals were reluctant to participate. The shame that comes with these acts is much greater than what it was a few decades ago. The suppression and mitigation of a racist motive behind acts can be described as dodging the identity of a racist discourse, a technique used more and more commonly as society develops political correctness further. Furthermore on this topic, the 40 subjects that were questioned consistently denied that their acts were racially motivated, but instead blamed the cause on provocation. This further reinforces that the emotion of shame is more impactful in society as we increasingly become more politically correct. In drawing similarities and extrapolating patterns from these 40 subjects, a few recurring qualities were evident. Most were young white men who had previous convictions. They grew up in poor white estates with little exposure to other races. Also, the lack of education was highlighted through the 40 subjects. Another interesting element of this investigation is the fact that a lot of the perpetrators had grown up in places that saw other ethnicities excelling, which has the potential to spark resentment towards that culture. Multiple psychologists have linked the emotion of resentment and shame to anger and violence. From this investigation, I have made the conclusion that explicit racism has decreased due to education, political correctness, and the general increase in wealth across Australia. Now for the meaty part of the argument. In saying all this, based on the credibility of psychological theories associated with the unconscious brain, it is true that social psychologically driven racism is still just as strong in the modern era and will continue to play a part of human behaviour. Let's look at these theories now. I've compared a few theories and drawn similarities and differences from each, which has led me to label psychological approaches as three categories: social development, human nature, and group behaviour. Social development in terms of the behaviours you develop as you become socialised into our Western society. Human nature in terms of the behaviours you automatically have right from the get-go simply because you are a part of the human race. And group behaviour. This category obviously relating to the theories behind how group behaviour changes every behaviour of the individual inside the group and ultimately breeds racism, consciously and unconsciously. So with social development, it's a concept for the understanding of why people are racist. The psychodynamic theory says that our personality is created by an accumulation of conscious and unconscious forces. It says that our childhood experiences shape how we act, and this is why everyone has an individual personality tailored to them, and them alone. As we develop and become more educated, our cognitive interpretations of everything act as a bias filter. This is for everything we see, smell, hear, taste, and feel, pretty much our physiological abilities. This then creates bias. A quote that perfectly reflects this, it says that you are who you eat, you are what you eat. But in adding to this, the psychodynamic theory would agree with the statement that you are who you meet. Social development incorporates who you spend time with. In following this idea of the psychodynamic theory, it is true that two people will see the same thing but interpret them very differently. This theoretical knowledge associated with the social development accommodates the opportunity for prejudice without knowing it. Next being human nature. It is hard to argue with the credible researchers and psychologists that have made conclusions about our human behaviour. German sociologist and philosopher Max Weber stated that we modify our behaviour based on assumptions of status, and what we consider our own status to be is dependent on social prestige. On its own, this doesn't seem like it would link to prejudice too much, but he goes on to state that hostility towards others that we classify as different is a universal feature that was built into our brains as a result of natural selection. We subconsciously believe that in favouring people within our own group or culture, we have more chance of survival. The two phrases he uses which jumps out at me are evolutionary tendencies and automative hostility. This provides an opinion on using human nature as an explanation to why people are racist. And to prove Weber's opinion, the Harvard University's implicit association test can be used. This is a test people can do online, and it uses different reaction-based games to find out what your race preference is. The test puts individuals into 7 categories: strong preference to white, moderate white, slight neutral, slight black, moderate black, and strong black. In the collection of averages between 2002 and 2015, these were the results: 24% strong white, 27% moderate white, 17% slight white, 18% neutral, 7% slight black, 5% moderate black, and 2% strong black. The obvious conclusion of these results is that implicit racism is very influential in today's culture still. However, there is some criticism and debate of the IAT. Scholars against say that there's too many factors involved that affect the results of the IAT to get accurate results and make conclusions. Scholars that argue for the IAT says it's an effective way of seeing if people are biased without them knowing it. So far, one correlation has been made, which helps in arguing the effectiveness of IAT. Researchers found that there's a correlation between the way doctors treated races and their results in the IAT in America. The IAT is not the only way of detecting unintentional bias. Another study was conducted on 5-year-old boys and girls. The kids were individually given a description of an intelligent person and had to guess who it was from a picture of a male and a female. The boys and girls equally picked the males significantly more than the females. Obviously, this is not racism but sexism. However, it is still related to this investigation because it's analysing the way we give bias to groups. This study is very interesting due to the fact of how young they were. They haven't even experienced social development yet or been educated about historic events that can create bias. So what has happened? In my opinion, the result proves the existence of human nature driving implicit bias and racism, but also very early institutionalisation of bias. The third driver is theories associated with group behaviour. The social identity theory believes that a person will sometimes identify themselves as not how they see themselves, but how others in a group see them. This has a big impact on pride, self-esteem, confidence, well-being, and ultimately how they behave in order to match their allocated persona. The discursive theory focuses on power relationships in society expressed through language and practices. The amount of power a relationship holds will emanate through behaviour. Lots of branches of this theory, however, one that relates to racism is how discourse analysis looks at how genes govern social groups and how society is structured. Furthermore, ARC's conformity studies prove that people in a group will usually say or do what is desired by the group because every individual has a fear of social punishment. These theories, in combination with the acknowledgement of human nature tendencies of bias and the social development of prejudice, are a toxic formula for fueling racism. To further reinforce the idea of group behaviour, let's look at an experiment that was done on group situations, where the aim was to see how the presence of multiple individuals affects explicit racism. In the first experiment, a group of people were talking casually when a plant, who was a part of the experiment, made a comment about Pakistan that would hopefully trigger some opinions. In the group dynamics experiment, all members projected an essence of racial prejudice at some point, but there are some interesting dynamics. One individual is actually restricted in her display of prejudice towards Pakistanis because their partner stopped them. Their partner said it was inappropriate, so the perpetrator stopped. This goes against the idea that groups always accelerate racism. On the other hand, a story of Jamaicans was laughed at by the others in the group, and this caused the storyteller to continue her story with increased description and over-exaggeration of the plot. She was supported by people around her, so she felt comfortable presenting it more so than if it was one-on-one. This follows the idea that effective support of others helps in portraying racism, and racism is contingent on the opinionated presence of others. The second experiment involves a plant and two other individuals. The plant only had to spark the conversation, and from there, the two subjects did the rest on their own. In analysing this conversation between the two, while the first experiment demonstrated both the ability for collaborative termination of prejudice as well as collaborative acceleration, the second experiment highlighted collaborative action. The ideas presented would not have been able to be spoken without the assistance of each other. Each time someone spoke, they trumped each other slowly because they were testing the waters for social acceptance. The racial slurs simply got worse and worse. These experiments are very interesting in making the correlation between group behaviour and racism. There is some criticism of racial discourse investigations. It can be argued that the results of these types of experiments are too artificial because the subjects of experiments are conflicted between establishing compatibility with the interviewees without identifying the views that the interviewee wants or expresses. Goffman rebuttals this criticism in saying that it is still an effective method, but care must be taken in segregating the situations that produce prejudice due to the group presence and simply incidental prejudice presence. Goffman ultimately gives more precedence to individualist racial prejudice rather than group behaviour. In conclusion, the outspoken perspectives of biological superiority and inferiority are almost gone, but the racial prejudice subconsciously follows. Education mitigates this, but doesn't eradicate it completely, as seen in news article text and behavioural concepts. Individually, these theories may not seem like they may be harmful to the production of racism, but in combining the ideas, you do get a toxic formula that provides reason and understanding behind human behaviour in being racist, both explicitly and implicitly. But the new world is making the gap between the implicit racism and explicit racism larger, which is a positive thing.